I'll never forget the look on his face. It was subtle. Rick's reactions always were, but I could see the shift in his expression the moment the words left my mouth. A flash of something in his eyes, a tightness in his jaw. And then just like that, he masked it with a small, polite smile. That night, we were hosting a dinner party. Just a few close friends, my coworker Jessica, her husband, Rick's longtime friend Max, and another couple whose names I've already forgotten. The wine was flowing, the conversation lively, and as always, Rick was sitting quietly at the end of the table, chiming in only when directly addressed. Rick has always been like that. Quiet, unassuming, the kind of man who lets others take the spotlight. It was one of the things that drew me to him in the beginning. His steadiness, his calm. But after 20 years of marriage, that steadiness had started to feel like stagnation. I don't even remember how the topic came up. Someone mentioned their job, Max, maybe. And suddenly, we were talking about careers, promotions, and ambitions. Jessica said something about how impressed she was with Rick's technical expertise, and without thinking, I opened my mouth and let out the words that started it all. "Oh, Rick? He's been doing the same thing for years. He's comfortable, doesn't like to rock the boat." It was a throwaway comment, meant as a joke. The kind of thing I'd said 100 times before, always with a smile, always in that light, teasing tone. Everyone laughed, including Rick. But this time, the laugh didn't quite reach his eyes. Looking back, I should have stopped there. But I didn't. The wine had loosened my tongue, and I was already riding the wave of everyone's amusement, so I kept going. "He's lucky I don't get bored easily," I said, chuckling. "Not everyone can handle being married to an engineer. It's not exactly exciting." The room went quiet for a beat, just long enough for the weight of my words to sink in. Rick's smile faltered, barely noticeable, but I caught it. Then he reached for his wine glass, taking a slow sip, and the conversation moved on. I didn't think much of it at the time. It wasn't the first time I'd poked fun at Rick's career in front of others, and he'd never seemed to mind before. He wasn't the type to get upset over little things. Or so I thought. It wasn't until later, after the guests had left and the house was quiet, that I realized something was wrong. Rick didn't say a word as we cleaned up. He moved through the kitchen with quiet efficiency, rinsing plates and stacking them in the dishwasher, his face unreadable. Normally, he'd crack a joke or make some comment about the evening, but tonight there was nothing. "Everything okay?" I asked, leaning against the counter, watching him. "Fine," he said without looking at me. "Fine." That one-word answer said everything. "Rick, if this is about what I said at dinner..." He paused, his hands resting on the edge of the sink. For a moment, I thought he was going to brush it off like he always did. But then he turned to face me, his eyes meeting mine, and there was something there I hadn't seen in years. "I know you like to joke, Claire," he said, his voice calm but firm. "But tonight, that wasn't just a joke." I opened my mouth to argue, to defend myself, but the words got caught in my throat. "I don't say much, but that doesn't mean I don't feel it." He continued, his gaze steady. "And tonight, you made me feel small." The air between us felt heavy, and for once, I didn't know what to say. Rick wasn't the type to confront me like this. He wasn't the type to confront anyone. "I didn't mean it that way," I said finally, my voice softer. "I know," he said, "but it still hurt." With that, he turned back to the sink, ending the conversation. The rest of the night passed in silence. Rick went to bed early, leaving me alone in the living room with my thoughts and an unfinished glass of wine. I kept replaying the dinner in my mind, every word I'd said, every laugh that followed. I hadn't meant to hurt him, I never did. But the truth was, I'd been frustrated with him for years. Rick's job had always been steady, dependable. He worked hard, but he never pushed for more. No promotions, no new ventures, just the same routine, day after day. Meanwhile, my career had taken off. I'd climbed the ladder at my marketing firm, built a reputation, made a name for myself. And somewhere along the way, I'd started resenting Rick for being content with less. But now, sitting there in the quiet, I couldn't shake the look in his eyes when he said those words. "You made me feel small." I told myself I'd apologize in the morning, that we'd talk it out and move on like we always did. But when I climbed into bed, Rick was already asleep, or pretending to be. He didn't stir when I slipped under the covers, and for the first time in a long time, I felt the distance between us like a physical thing. I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of the bedroom door closing. Rick was standing there, his silhouette framed by the faint light from the hallway. "You're awake," he said, his voice low. "Yeah," I said, sitting up. "What's going on?" For a moment, he didn't answer. He just stood there, watching me. Then he stepped closer, his movements slow and deliberate. "Claire," he said, his tone steady but with an edge I didn't recognize. "We need to talk." It wasn't a request, and in that moment, I knew this conversation wasn't going to end the way our arguments usually did, with me brushing him off and him letting it slide. This time, Rick wasn't going to let it slide. Rick stood at the foot of the bed, his expression unreadable. His shoulders were tense, his jaw set, but there was something else in his eyes, something I couldn't quite place. It wasn't anger, exactly. It was something deeper, sharper, like he had been holding back for a long time, and now it was about to spill over. "You humiliated me tonight," he said finally, his voice low but steady. I opened my mouth to respond, but he held up a hand to stop me. "Let me finish," he said. "You think I don't notice when you make those comments? That I don't care, but I do. And tonight?" He paused, exhaling slowly. "Tonight you crossed a line." The words hung in the air between us, heavy and final. I swallowed hard, suddenly feeling very small under his gaze. Rick had never spoken to me like this before. So direct, so sure of himself. Usually he avoided conflict, brushing off my barbs with a shrug or a soft laugh. But now the quiet man I had taken for granted was standing tall, his presence commanding in a way that sent a strange thrill through me. "I'm sorry," I said softly, my voice breaking the silence. "I didn't mean." "No," he interrupted, his tone firm but not harsh. "You don't get to brush this off with an apology, Claire. Not this time." I blinked, stunned. This wasn't like him. But before I could say anything else, he stepped closer, his eyes locked on mine. "You've spent years acting like what I do doesn't matter," he continued, his voice quiet but intense. "Like being steady, dependable, and boring makes me less of a man. But let me remind you of something, Claire." He leaned down, his face inches from mine, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "I'm not small, and I'm done letting you make me feel that way." The room felt charged, the air between us thick with tension. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat, and I didn't know if it was fear, guilt, or something else entirely. And then, before I could process what was happening, Rick's lips were on mine. The kiss was unlike anything I'd felt from him in years. It was forceful, insistent, as if he was pouring all of his frustration, his hurt, and his need into it. His hands gripped my shoulders, pulling me closer, and for a moment I couldn't think, couldn't breathe. When we kissed before, when we even kissed at all, it was usually soft, almost hesitant. But this was different. There was nothing hesitant about the way his hands moved to my waist, about the way he pressed me back against the pillows. "Rick," I started, but he silenced me with another kiss, his mouth hot and demanding against mine. "Don't talk," he said against my lips, his voice low and commanding. "Just listen." My mind was racing, but my body responded instinctively. My hands found their way to his shoulders, gripping him as he shifted over me. The weight of him, the heat of his skin through his shirt, it was overwhelming, consuming. And for the first time in years, I felt like I wasn't in control. Rick didn't stop. He didn't let me retreat into my usual defenses or try to steer the moment in a direction that felt safer. Instead, he pushed forward, stripping away every barrier I'd built between us. His hands were everywhere, tracing the curve of my hip, the line of my jaw, the dip of my waist. He moved with a confidence that I hadn't seen in years, as if he knew exactly what he was doing, exactly what I needed. "This is what you forgot," he said, his voice a low growl against my ear. "This is who I am, Claire." His words sent a shiver down my spine, and I realized with a jolt that he was right. I had forgotten what it felt like to be wanted like this, to be claimed, to lose myself in him. The night unfolded in a blur of heat and desperation, of whispered words and tangled limbs. Every touch, every kiss felt like a revelation, like we were rediscovering each other after years of being lost. And when it was over, when we were lying in the dark, our breathing still ragged, Rick reached for my hand. "I love you, Claire," he said softly, his voice breaking through the silence. "But I need you to respect me." I turned to look at him, my chest tightening at the raw honesty in his eyes. "I do respect you," I said, my voice trembling. I didn't realize how much I'd been hurting you." His thumb brushed over the back of my hand, a small, comforting gesture. "I know you didn't," he said, "but now you do." The next morning, I woke up before him, my mind still reeling from everything that had happened. As I sat on the edge of the bed, staring out the window, I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted between us. For years, I'd seen Rick as predictable, reliable, safe. But now, I was starting to see the man he really was, the strength and passion he'd been hiding behind that quiet exterior. And I couldn't stop thinking about it. Over the next few days, things were different. Rick didn't bring up the dinner party again, and I didn't either. But there was a new energy between us, an unspoken understanding that hadn't been there before. He started coming home later than usual, his focus shifting to a project at work that he hadn't mentioned before. At first, I thought he was pulling away again, retreating into himself. But then, one night, he casually mentioned that he'd been put in charge of a major new initiative, something that could lead to a promotion if it went well. "That's amazing," I said, genuinely impressed. He nodded, a small smile playing on his lips. "Yeah, it is." There was something about the way he said it, calm, confident, without a hint of the self-doubt I was so used to seeing in him. And for the first time, I realized how wrong I'd been about him. Rick wasn't small, he never had been. I was just too blind to see it. The shift in our relationship didn't happen overnight. There were still moments of tension, times when my old habits crept back in. But every time I started to doubt him, Rick was there to remind me. Whether through his actions, his words, or the way he made me feel when we were alone together. And slowly, I began to see him for who he really was. The man I had fallen in love with all those years ago. For a while, things between Rick and me settled into a new rhythm. The tension from that night seemed to dissipate, replaced by a quiet understanding that neither of us acknowledged directly. Rick carried himself differently, with a quiet confidence that drew me in more than I wanted to admit. But there was still an edge to him, a distance that lingered. And I couldn't quite shake the feeling that I had opened a door I didn't know how to close. It wasn't until his work became the center of attention that the cracks started to show again. One Friday evening, Rick came home later than usual. I was in the kitchen, finishing up a glass of wine and scrolling aimlessly on my phone, when I heard the door open. "Hey," I called out, glancing up as he stepped inside. "Long day?" "You could say that," he replied, setting his bag down and loosening his tie. He didn't look tired, though. If anything, he looked energized, his eyes sharp, his movements deliberate. "Big project coming along?" I asked, trying to sound casual. Rick paused, leaning against the counter. "Actually, yeah. It's going better than I expected. They've asked me to present the proposal to the board next week." "That's great," I said, genuinely excited for him. He nodded, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Yeah, it is. It could mean a lot for the company, and for me." There was something about the way he said it, something that made my chest tighten. For years, I'd dismissed his career as steady but unimpressive, never imagining that he might have ambitions beyond the day-to-day grind. And now, here he was, quietly proving me wrong. But instead of feeling proud, I felt unsettled. The following week, Rick threw himself into his work like I'd never seen before. He spent long hours at the office, coming home late with a focus that's both admirable and unnerving. I told myself it was a good thing, that he was finally stepping into his potential. But I couldn't help feeling like I was being left behind. The shift in our dynamic was subtle at first. Rick wasn't the passive, easygoing man I'd grown used to. He was confident, assertive, even in the little things. When we talked, he didn't just listen. He pushed back, challenging my opinions in a way that was equal parts frustrating and exhilarating. And then, there were the nights. One evening, after he'd come home late again, I decided to push him. "You've been spending a lot of time at work lately," I said as we sat down to dinner. Rick glanced up from his plate, his expression calm. "Yeah, it's a big project, you know that." "I know," I said, trying to keep my tone light. "But it feels like you're married to your job these days." He didn't take the bait. Instead, he set down his fork and met my gaze. "You're not used to me being this busy, are you?" The question caught me off guard. "I just think it's different," I said carefully. "It is," he said simply, picking up his fork again. "And it's not going to stop anytime soon." There was no malice in his tone, but the finality of his words hit me like a brick. For years, I'd been the one with the demanding career, the one who dictated the pace of our lives. Now Rick was taking up space in a way I hadn't anticipated, and I didn't know how to handle it. That night, as we lay in bed, I couldn't stop thinking about his words. The man next to me was both familiar and foreign, someone I thought I knew completely but who now felt like a stranger in the best and worst ways. I rolled over, reaching for him, and for a moment, I thought he might brush me off. But then his hand found mine, pulling me closer, and the tension that had been simmering between us exploded. It wasn't like before. This time there was no hesitation, no pretense of control. Rick was commanding, his movements deliberate and assured, as if he was making a point with every touch, every kiss. "You keep trying to put me in a box, Claire," he murmured against my ear, his voice low and rough. "But I'm not the man you think I am." His words sent a shiver down my spine, and for the first time in years, I felt completely unguarded. There was no room for my usual defenses, no space for sarcasm or control. Rick had taken the lead, and all I could do was follow. The next morning, I woke up feeling like something had shifted between us again. Rick was already up, his side of the bed empty and the faint smell of coffee drifting through the air. When I walked into the kitchen, he was standing at the counter, his phone in one hand and a cup of coffee in the other. He looked up as I entered, giving me a small smile. "Morning," he said, his tone casual. "Morning," I replied, still trying to process the night before. For a moment, we stood there in silence, the unspoken tension between us lingering like a third presence in the room. And then, as if sensing my thoughts, Rick set down his coffee and turned to face me. "I'm not going to apologize for changing, Claire," he said, his voice steady. "I know it's throwing you off, but this is who I am now, and you're going to have to decide if that's something you can handle." His words hit me like a punch to the gut. For years, I'd been the one steering the ship in our marriage, the one who dictated the terms of our relationship. And now, Rick was forcing me to confront a truth I wasn't ready to face. I wasn't in control anymore. The shift in our dynamic came to a head a few days later, when I got a call from Jessica. "Claire," she said, her voice laced with curiosity, "did you know Rick's company is pitching a huge contract to one of the biggest clients in the state? Max mentioned it the other day." "No," I said slowly, my chest tightening. "He didn't tell me." "Well, it sounds like a big deal," Jessica continued. "Max said Rick's leading the whole thing. He's been talking about it like it's the biggest opportunity of his career." I barely heard the rest of what she said. All I could think about was how much Rick had changed, and how little I'd noticed. That night, I confronted him. "Why didn't you tell me about the contract?" I asked as he walked through the door. Rick looked at me, his expression unreadable. "Because I didn't think it mattered to you." His words cut deeper than I expected. "Of course it matters," I said, my voice rising. "Does it?" he asked, setting down his bag. "Because for years, Claire, you've made it clear that what I do doesn't matter. So forgive me if I didn't feel the need to share every detail." I opened my mouth to argue, but the weight of his words stopped me. He was right. I'd spent years dismissing his work, his ambitions, his value. And now, he was finally standing his ground, refusing to let me diminish him any longer. And for the first time, I realized how much I had underestimated him. Rick's words stayed with me long after our conversation ended. For years, I had told myself that I was the ambitious one, the driving force in our marriage. I convinced myself that Rick didn't want more, that he was content to stay in his comfort zone while I climbed the ladder in my career. But now, as I watched him grow into this confident, driven version of himself, I was forced to confront a painful truth. I hadn't just underestimated him. I'd built my own narrative to justify the way I treated him. That weekend, Rick had to go into the office to finalize the presentation for his pitch. Normally, I would have spent my Saturday running errands or meeting Jessica for brunch, but instead, I found myself wandering into his office at home. His desk was meticulously organized, notes, diagrams, and mock-ups laid out in precise rows. In the center was a thick binder labeled with the name of the project, North Point Development Proposal. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the binder, before finally picking it up. The first page was a summary of the project, written in Rick's neat, methodical handwriting. As I read through it, I felt a pang of guilt twist in my chest. The scope of the project was massive, far beyond anything I had imagined. He wasn't just managing a team or making incremental changes, he was leading a full-scale redesign of a critical system for one of the state's largest manufacturing firms. This wasn't the work of a man who was comfortable. This was the work of a man who was capable, intelligent, and deeply dedicated. And I had belittled him for it. When Rick came home that evening, I was waiting for him in the kitchen. He looked surprised to see me sitting there, a glass of wine in front of me and the binder open on the table. "You looked through it," he said, his tone unreadable as he set his bag down. "I did," I admitted. "I hope you don't mind." He shrugged, his face calm but guarded. "It's not a secret." I gestured for him to sit, my stomach twisting with nerves. "Rick, I didn't realize how big this was. What you're doing? It's incredible." For a moment, he didn't say anything, he just looked at me, his expression softening slightly. "Why are you telling me this now, Claire?" "Because I was wrong," I said, my voice trembling. "I've spent years acting like your work didn't matter, like you didn't matter. And I don't know why I did that. Maybe it was easier than facing my own insecurities, or maybe I was just being selfish. But I see it now, Rick. I see you." His eyes softened, and he reached across the table, his hand covering mine. "I never needed you to see me as some big-shot executive," he said quietly. "All I wanted was for you to respect what I do, to respect me." "I do," I said, tears welling in my eyes. "I really do." Over the next few days, I made a conscious effort to show Rick how much I valued him, not just as my husband but as a person. I asked him about his work, listened intently as he explained the details of his proposal, and celebrated the small victories with him. But the most surprising change wasn't in how I saw him, it was in how he saw me. Rick's newfound confidence seemed to extend to every aspect of our relationship. He was more present, more assertive, and more willing to challenge me in ways that were both thrilling and humbling. One evening, after his big presentation, Rick came home with a bottle of champagne. "We got it," he said, a grin spreading across his face as he set the bottle on the counter. "You got the contract?" I asked, my eyes widening. He nodded. "The board loved the proposal. They want us to start next month." "That's amazing," I said, throwing my arms around him. For the first time in years, I felt genuine pride, not just for what he had accomplished, but for the man he had become. As we stood there, wrapped in each other's arms, I felt a spark reignite between us. It wasn't just about the success of his project or the shift in our dynamic. It was about rediscovering the love and respect that had been buried under years of complacency and misunderstanding. That night, Rick showed me once again why I had fallen in love with him. In the bedroom, he was a mix of tenderness and intensity, his touch both familiar and new. Every kiss, every movement felt deliberate, as if he was reminding me of who he was, not the man I had imagined him to be, but the man he truly was. "You never really saw me, Claire," he said softly, his lips brushing against my ear. "But now, you do. Don't you?" "Yes," I whispered, my voice trembling. "I see you, Rick. I see everything." The next morning, as I watched him leave for work, I felt a sense of clarity that I hadn't felt in years. Our marriage wasn't perfect. It never had been. But for the first time, I understood what it meant to truly see and value each other, flaws and all. And I knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, we would face them together. Looking back, I realized that night wasn't just about what happened in the bedroom. It was about so much more. It was about breaking down the walls we had built between us, confronting the truths we had been too afraid to face, and rediscovering the love and respect that had been there all along. Rick wasn't the one who needed to change. I was. And in doing so, I found the man I had been missing. The man who had been there all along.